Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit, the horror movie review podcast for horror fans and fanatics alike. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, delivering horror movie reviews and discussions of both classic and current films every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for your twisted pleasure. Please be aware that episodes may include spoilers, and as always, I hope you enjoy. Welcome to another installment to my year-long Masters of Horror celebration, in which I'm joined by a guest every Friday to chat about one of their favorite films from our month's featured director. For the month of May, we're honoring the haunting horrors of Mike Flanagan, the man behind such films as Hush, Oculus, and countless Stephen King adaptations, such as today's focus, that being the horror odyssey Dr. Sleep, in which we meet back up with Dan Torrance, played by Ewan McGregor, and see firsthand that the traumatic events that unfolded at the Overlook Hotel have had lingering effects. Now, struggling with alcoholism and drifting up the East Coast, Doc is at a crossroads. Though when he discovers a teenager named Abra, who shares his supernatural ability known as the Shine, he sets out to save her from the grasp of a cult known as the True Knot, who feeds off of others' shine. And joining me to tackle Flanagan's behemoth horror undertaking is BloodyDisgusting.com's video game editor and co-host of the weekly horror gaming podcast Safe Room, his returning friend of the show, Neil Bolt. Neil, welcome back to the show, man.
It's been a while, though we have worked together in a different capacity. It has been a while on this side of things. So.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk horror movies with you for a change instead of horror games. Another love that we both share. But today we're talking about Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep, a film that seems monumental and almost insurmountable to talk about, just in terms of leaps and bounds. The idea like you would have to tackle to make a follow-up to The Shining, which seems so improbable and illogical and maybe not the best task for a majority of horror filmmakers, whether they were capable of doing so or not. But I guess before we get into Dr. Sleep, what was your first introduction to Mike Flanagan?
It was Hush, which I think was on Netflix at the time. It's like, I had no sort of knowledge of him beyond that. And then it was after he'd done other things like Oculus. But I watched that, and if for anyone doesn't know, it hasn't come up yet. It's about a deaf lady who has a home invasion happen to her, and it's like that resonates with me. As I've said on Letterboxd recently about the film Sound of Metal, it's like I'm half deaf myself, so deafness as a storyline is interesting to me. It's like I appreciate when it's done well. I think Flanagan really did such a good job in conveying it there, for what it was, and made it an entertaining thing without it being like goofy in what it could have been. And so I sort of paid attention to that, and I suppose like everyone, you start noticing what else he's done, and I think he has a natural feel to the way he does things that makes him the perfect sort of candidate to make Stephen King stuff work on the screen. He'd done it before, before Dr. Sleep, of course, and with Gerald's Game, and so it's he'd done it, and that immediately was like, okay, if anyone's going to take a crack at Dr. Sleep, which is a book that I really like, it's like The Shining itself is just, I'm sure we'll bring it up a lot in this, because the film and the book, it all intertwines so well with this, and you can't avoid it. And I think Flanagan finds the best of both worlds with Dr. Sleep in terms of adapting both styles. But he is the closest I think we've ever had to King's voice in movies, like that. And he's not showy. He's not, overzealous with stuff. He does stuff as it should be. He isn't going for shock value and silliness, and he's as much as he's good at adapting King, he's not doing that part of King that was on cocaine and just writing whatever fucking nonsense came into his head at the time. He's reining it in, and disappointing as that may be for some people that he hasn't done everything that King did. Dr. Sleep is like the perfect thing for him, I suppose, because it is the clean King sort of coming back to a book that had very much was ingrained in his own troubles. The Shining and dealing with Jack Torrance's alcoholism is Stephen King's problems. They are incarnate in that book, and this feels like his sort of AA meeting in a way, his reckoning of that, and it permeates throughout the film, throughout the book, and it felt special in that regard to have, because hard enough for Mike Flanagan to have to work on a sequel to The Shining, the film,
Right.
and he doesn't go to try and continue the so-so TV film version. He goes for Kubrick's version from the off. King himself to follow up The Shining like that, as he did with a character, and show that it hadn't been a happy ending for Danny, and how things had really just gone downhill, and how he, as much as he tried to avoid the same fate his father had, that he's going down that path further and further. It's just, really didn't think I'd end up liking the film. I really didn't. I thought it would be difficult to do, and because it was based on Kubrick's version a lot of the time, which King notoriously hates, that was where I was slightly concerned, because Flanagan works best doing King's work as King intended, and yet he's trying to aim for the Kubrick side of things, and I can see why that can have problems somewhere in the film where it doesn't always gel. But I think he does a really good job of doing both, and melding it into one film. It feels very much like a Stephen King story, whilst also feeling like a continuation of Kubrick's different vision.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think Hush being your first introduction is such a great introduction to Flanagan's style, right? Because we all know him as the de facto Stephen King adaptator right now, right? I mean, he has a proven track record with adapting King's voice to the screen, and yet I find that his independent films, or rather his original films, they really strike at the element of his King adaptations that is strongest, which is, and it sounds so simple to say, it's like this idea that the people are always front and center, and they're so well fleshed out, and they feel like real people, whereas it's real people in a spectacle, whereas King, a lot of the time I find, he wrote these larger-than-life spectacles, and at one point or another, the characters themselves feel like a continuation of that spectacle in a way that, while not to try to knock Stephen King, which would be would be a whole nother error in judgment on my part, but the idea that Flanagan's really able to make people feel authentic and genuine, and then put them into these very creative horror scenarios that King obviously had crafted. I find that is what makes films like Doctor Sleep, which seem insurmountable from the outside, it makes it work so well in a way that I think we both probably, and fans in general probably feared, right? This disconnect between, okay, he's doing a sequel to Kubrick's version, but how much of King's voice is going to be lost in that? Or vice versa, right? This idea, trying to balance so many things on top of having his own flair, and not just being like, well, this is just going to be a combination of two people's voices, right? It's really three voices melded into one film in a way that it surprises me every time I watch it. And of course, I believe you did as well. Did you watch the director's cut?
Oh yeah, I've only ever watched the director's cut. It's like, again, something about King's stuff, when I like it, I don't mind as long as it can be, because I'm so used to that sort of epic storytelling. I think even with the recent adaptations of It, they still didn't quite feel right to me, because it wasn't long enough for that story. The Stand TV series just didn't quite get it. It still felt rushed for what it was, and it's so rare that something, it's normally his short stories that end up being adapted best because they fit a movie length thing. That's why The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me, or something like Green Mile, that was serialized, and made into several books. That was, like, probably to me the first example of Stephen King's longer work working on screen almost perfectly, to the point where I always recount the point of watching The Green Mile in the cinema and being able to go for a toilet break and know exactly what was coming next, because it was so tight to what happened in the book. And it was like I knew I wouldn't miss too much, and I ended up being right. So it's great like that. But King is not faultless. He's not flawless, and that's what I always like about his work. He has his faults and his problems, and that has fueled some of his best work sometimes. And it shows, he has had like wave after wave of popularity, just as it seems like he's faded out of the limelight. He's up again with another adaptation of his work, or he's got another book coming out. And of any author I've ever read, I've read the most of his books. It's like ever since reading It, which is like my de facto favorite book ever, to the point that I destroyed my original copy from overreading, and had to buy a new one. For Flanagan to come in and get it so right is important. But like I said, here he's being a little more ambitious. It's like with Gerald's Game, it's an easier one to do, because it has that short story style to it, where it works for a movie, and he follows that fairly well, and it does work. And here, as we said, he's tackling Kubrick, he's tackling King, and past and present in terms of doing it. And it's genuinely amazing that he does the job he does. And like I said, I get that depending on what angle you come in at with this film, that it may be annoying or dull, or not what you expected, because you have those different perspectives you're coming from. If it had been straight, we'll ignore Kubrick's film and just make our own, you'd understand maybe, and I don't think it would work as well.
It definitely wouldn't. And I think something that I really picked up on in this most recent rewatch of the director's cut is how unalienating the film feels to people that maybe are not the most hardcore fans of The Shining, or maybe they're not even super familiar with it, right? I mean, it is a sequel, but the reality is that some of the marketing issues that this movie had when it came out is that the acting title is Dr. Sleep, but it's a sequel to The Shining. And how many people outside of like hardcore King fans or hardcore horror fans, what does Dr. Sleep mean to them?
Yeah.
Right? It's this idea that if they had included The Shining 2, Dr. Sleep, this movie probably would have had more success in theater, right? This is not saying like it is not a phenomenal film, but just the idea in box office numbers, right? And so I think that it's very interesting. It's a case where there's a possibility some people could have stumbled into this movie and been like, oh, I don't know anything about The Shining, or I don't even know it's related to that. And yet this movie tells you everything you need to know about The Shining and the events, and you have enough background that what happens in the film doesn't feel alienating. If anything, it feels inclusive to people that are stumbling into Dr. Sleep, but also there's enough moments in there that cater to fans of the series, fans of King, to the degree that while newcomers might not pick up on those moments, they still don't feel like, oh, I'm being left out of the significance of something, or I feel like I'm just missing what is going on behind the scenes, or the elements of this that really make it gel with the original film. It's one of those things where I was like, it just shows that Flanagan's love for King's world, The Shining, obviously Dr. Sleep, but also just his sensibility as a horror filmmaker. This is a film that, like, when I saw this originally, I hadn't watched The Shining in probably 10 years before that, just because, for whatever reason. And yet, I was able to sit through this movie, and I felt like I was hadn't missed a beat. I felt like I was given just enough that, oh, okay, should I have gone back and watched The Shining previously? Of course, but because I am me, I managed not to. But then it made me want to go back and rewatch The Shining, which then, of course, gave me even more of an appreciation for Dr. Sleep. But it wasn't like I was sitting in the theater being like, I feel like I'm missing a piece of this, or I feel like this movie is incomplete without watching it with The Shining beforehand. So it was a very interesting balance for me, and especially on the rewatch of getting to watch the director's cut and just seeing how well Flanagan is able to flesh out the narrative that was in the theatrical version in a way that doesn't feel like it is padding, or it doesn't feel like a director kind of just being like, oh, this scene would be better if it was longer. Every minute that's added feels significant overall, and it just complements the world of The Shining, but also just in terms of Dr. Sleep being independent from The Shining, just the way in which they really sort of expand upon key moments that make it feel like this sort of dark fantasy odyssey almost, in a way that is incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, and they change certain aspects. Which this is the bold thing that Flanagan does, is whereas he could have made it more like King, he doubled down on the Kubrick world by making that finale more to do with Kubrick's vision, than the book does. In setting it like they do, and having all these callbacks to the Overlook and stuff like that. I especially, I know this is more likely because time and patience. That recreating something that once was is always going to be slightly imperfect when you do it. You're going to notice differences because, especially with The Shining, for me, because it's a formative film in terms of my horror upbringing, and there are aspects of this film where you look at, like, for example, the Gold Room sign outside the bar. I always pick up on the fact that the typeface is smaller than it is in the original. The way they frame characters that were in that film, obviously with different actors, Flanagan gets a few of his favorites back to play certain people, like Henry Thomas, old Elliot from E.T., being Jack Torrance, in ghost form. I like to attribute it to the idea that that's just Danny's sort of swimmy memory of how things were. That people don't look like they did once, but it's kind of the same, and there's this sort of, it's almost like a continuation of what Kubrick did in terms of how that set was made and how it wasn't quite, real, and how it didn't make sense in how the hotel structure worked out. In that, this memory of the hotel isn't quite how he remembers it, but enough that, you watching it gets that it is still that place, that it's still like that. But, being an adult, you remember things differently from your childhood than you probably did when you were younger. You don't have that sort of vivid memory quite like you did. So, yeah, I like to think that those sort of callbacks and where they had to use those, other actors, obviously, is that, it's just him remembering people differently, especially because, he's been on this odyssey of drinking constantly to sort of blot out his past.
I really love that interpretation of it, or that sort of examination of it, because that really fuels the film's overall theme, which is like trauma, right? And unresolved trauma, and seeing how, and this is something that I think is really, really fleshed out well in the director's cut with that extra time, which kind of just speaks to Flanagan's sort of economical use of time and ensuring that no extra moment feels like padding. But I mean, the way that the movie opens up, we get a brief callback to Danny in the Overlook as a child, biking as he did, and then to room 237, and seeing the rotting woman in there. Like, okay, my greatest fear going into the film was that this was going to rest too heavily on the laurels of one of the most famous horror movies ever made, right? That's the initial fear for anything, is that, okay, it's going to be lots of callbacks to the Overlook and whatnot, and we're going to get all these nods to it, and it's going to almost outshadow the story of Dr. Sleep in and of itself. But that never happens, and Flanagan very smartly bookends the film with the return to the Overlook. We do get, of course, a couple of callbacks that are brief scenes at the Overlook. The intro I just mentioned. Also, when the Overlook begins to wake up, there's that scene where the bar starts lighting up, and then you see that glass of whiskey that's poured that's on the counter, right? So we do get these brief moments, and the rotting woman shows up. But the film is very, very precise in showing us what Danny and his mother's whoa, Freudian slip there. Danny and his mother's relationship is like after surviving Jack Torrance in the Overlook. We see how it's affected them, and it's not this sort of like bubbly, oh, the past is the past. We see these two very traumatized and haunted people, and the way in which we explore that, and having the flashback where Dick Hallorann comes back and talks to Danny as a boy and everything, and trying to explaining more to him about the powers that he has, The Shining itself, how he himself was a victim of an abusive, I believe it was an uncle in his case. And that scene, initially that little detail might seem somewhat inconsequential, but I find that the director's cut, it fleshes that out to the degree where it shows Dick Hallorann is not speaking as an exposition mouthpiece. He's speaking from experience in a lot of ways, and his ability to relate to Doc and his ability to kind of shepherd him down this very confusing and still very traumatic past of his and Powers. And there's something really special in that relationship that I love so much. And I love that, and granted, I haven't read the novel, but I love that we get more than one scene with Dick Hallorann again, because my least favorite part of Kubrick's film is that he kills off that character, and it's a character that I love. And so to get to multiple scenes with him and it not being like this 30-second nod where, oh, he shows up and then he disappears. We get substantial dialogue from him and showing his mentoring of Danny. That's one of my favorite elements of the entire movie, and it just shows Flanagan's love for the universe and the characters and really giving them their, as it were, shine.
Yeah, and just to say, with the book obviously being different and that he survives, he is there in the beginning of the book. So it plays out pretty much the same, but he's actually living at that point when he has that conversation. And yeah, it's just one of those things where much like the end, they're sort of deviating from the book because of trying to incorporate what Kubrick did, and that's fair enough. You understand why. It shows again that Flanagan appreciates King's ideas more because he tries to incorporate them even where Kubrick's story might contradict them.
That whole interaction between Doc and Dick really reinforces his relationship with Abra, and it fuels more of the reason for why he feels compelled to help her and initially fighting off the True Knot or defeating them in the long run. I mean, in the theatrical version, I wouldn't say that it feels rushed, but the director's cut, it feels perfect in establishing the relationships of these characters, the motivation, the inevitable build up to that, right? Because Doc is very sort of like, maybe I should revert back to where I am, keep my head down, potentially end up drinking again, which in the long run we know would be probably his undoing in a lot of ways. And I find that just that added time, it allows all of these elements that are fantastic in the theatrical version to really flourish into something special that feel organic in a way that it just so seamlessly bleeds through the entire film that it's one of those movies where it's like, okay, it's almost 3 hours long, or it is 3 hours long, and it doesn't feel that way because I'm so engrossed in the relationships with the characters. And then of course, by the time you get to the finale, it's like, oh shit, we get to go back to the Overlook and we get to kind of like revel in that nostalgia. And yet that nostalgia that we're exploring is done so in Flanagan's own creative voice, and he's able to expand on these things and bring them to life in a way that it doesn't just feel like he's kind of resting on the laurels of past successes, which again is my fear whenever they sort of want to dig up a franchise that has been dormant for so long. And of course, like, it's probably the most pop culturally referenced horror film almost of all time. And so the fear for me naturally is that it's like, oh, okay, we're going to get the twins and all these different things just over and over and over and over. But Flanagan is such a smart filmmaker and so economical in his sort of exploring each of the storylines, each of the characters, and filling it with enough of King's voice, enough of Kubrick's lens, but he never forgets to put his own touch on everything.
Absolutely.
And I think that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. He's constantly, as much as the homage is there to how Kubrick does things, and it's mostly in the musical choices, like the old Heartbeat style soundtrack is there from The Shining. That's pervades throughout the film. But the way it's shot generally, apart from the aerial shots that mimic when they drive up in the beginning of The Shining, which you have a little bit of that at the beginning, a little bit later when they're going up during the snowstorm. Otherwise, it's very much Flanagan style, in his way of doing things. It is undeniably his film at the end of the day. And maybe that takes a little away from it when you get towards the end, and it does start to become a bit of a love-in for Kubrick's film. And they maybe overdo the whole Overlook thing a little bit, and it becomes a superhero movie, which, to be fair, Dr. Sleep as a book is less about horror and more about, the themes you see in the film, you know, and how Danny is having a redemption arc from and trying to not be like his father.
Yeah, I always describe the movie to my friends that maybe aren't familiar with The Shining, or they're just not the biggest horror fans. I always describe it to them as it being like the closest thing to a Justice League Dark movie that we would get, right? This idea where it's like, okay, there's these people with powers. It's grounded enough so, bar one particular scene, people aren't flying around or throwing heavy objects at one another, right? It is somewhat grounded a little bit. But then you also have these like Western style shootout scenes at the back end of the film, which I love because it's so random, but at the same time, it's executed on in a way that I'm not expecting from somebody like Flanagan, who doesn't have a history with action scenes. And so that was like a nice little surprise at the end of the movie. But I think even in visiting the Overlook, and yeah, they do recreate some of the scenes from the original film, I still like how you notice just enough of his little touches, right? It might be similar steps that Jack Torrance himself took throughout the Overlook Hotel and these things, but it still feels Flanagan to me in the sense that he changes just enough so that way it doesn't feel like you're like, okay, you couldn't think of anything more original here than just like returning to what has worked in the past, right? I think whether it's something as simple as the soundtrack, like you said, or the way in which he changes the perspective of the lens. I think in one point there's a higher lens that observes Doc walking through the halls again where his father was, or even like the lights turning on as soon as he steps under them. Like just little stylistic touches like that go a long way for me in fueling those moments that are obviously the groundwork is nostalgia for the original, but at the same time Flanagan does just enough that it doesn't feel like it is just cashing in on the past in a way that if it had been maybe a lesser filmmaker or something to that extent, it might have just felt sort of like, okay, you're just trying to do Kubrick, which in the end of the day is not going to work out for you.
Yeah, I mean, a good example actually of misinterpreting nostalgia for The Shining in another film is in Ready Player One, which takes its little moment from The Shining, much like it does many other moments in that film, where it takes a pop culture thing and just uses it as a prop. And while the initial reaction is, oh, surprise, they use this, that's cool, like that, when you think about it in the long run, it really doesn't add anything. You know, it's a very token sort of use of what it can be. And as you say, in many filmmakers' cases, that's what we would have got. You know, because that's what the studios would have demanded. It's like, oh, we just want a film that sort of touches base with this sort of thing. And that's fine. I get that. That's how they want to sell stuff. It's just annoying when you could do so much better. I mean, no one's immune from it. Ridley Scott did it to his own bloody creation with Alien, with Alien Covenant. He went and bastardized the very thing he made. So it's, again, just props to Flanagan for understanding so well that, he can have the balls to try and, I mean, he's not emulating Kubrick in terms of style because Christ, he knows himself, he's a relatively humble filmmaker by comparison. He knows what he likes, he knows what he can do. He's not striving for that kind of perfection. He's not going to traumatize an actress for life just because he wants to get the right shot. So that bleeds into how he does this, and while that doesn't make quite as an effective film, that makes The Shining so iconic, and makes it what it is. But it took a lot of suffering and a lot of pain and to get it to that point, and to pretty much ignore the source material in a lot of ways. And what I like about Doctor Sleep is it takes that and drags King's original ideas back into that. The alcoholism is really not touched upon that much in The Shining. It's in Kubrick's The Shining. It's really more about that. Oh well, Jack Nicholson's evil. That's it. It's like he succumbed too easily to it. That's it. Done. Like that. Whereas this is very much a case of like you are destined to be in this cycle of violence and regret if you don't change your ways, which I think comes across very well later in the film when he does essentially face up to his father, at the bar. Even it's, as much as it's all this whole fan servicey thing of being a direct mimic of the conversation Jack has with the previous bartender in The Shining, it also has this reckoning for Danny and his father, where he can sort of tell him the things he could never tell him because of his demise, and it sort of it does everything for the film going on.
I mean, again, it could have been just a very sort of black and white, like you had said, this, well, he succumbed to alcoholism, so he was weak or something like that on the surface, or it could have been Flanagan just being like, hey, it'd be cool if we could recreate that scene from the original. And yet the human element is so present throughout the entire film that the lead up to that feels very earned, and it takes on this reckoning, as you so eloquently put it, like this reckoning moment where he gets to say to his father all these things that he wanted to in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And the AA speech that he gives, I find really stood out to me on this most recent rewatch, this idea that he talks about his drinking. The drinking and the rage was like the only way to connect with the memory of his father. And it shows that was the deep root of not only his trauma, but that was like the relationship he had with his father in a lot of ways. And that stood out to me so much as Flanagan, again, making sure that people are front and center. It's not, well, I've been traumatized, so I'm going to drink a lot to try to forget, which, okay, that's what every single filmmaker that's ever had alcoholic characters has touched upon and been the root of. But just that little line of dialogue, it really brings out the human in Doc in a lot of ways, in the sense that, hey, he's doing these things. There's a reason for it. It's not just to forget. Like, how many times have we had to listen to, I want to forget, so I'm going to drink? Okay, we've had characters in the past do that. But him saying, like, this violence and this self-destructive behavior is a way to connect with something that I was never able to connect with in a way, and a connection I long for, even if at the end of the day, it was not the most healthy of connections. I think it just shows that people are a lot deeper than sort of what you see on the surface. And Flanagan always has a thoughtful approach to everything that he touches. And you're bringing up Hush at the very beginning. I mean, again, if it had been a lesser filmmaker, it would have felt exploitive to have the victim be death.
Yeah.
Whereas Flanagan's handling of it makes it a strength in some ways, and it makes her persevere in spite of being deaf, right? This idea that had it been another filmmaker, would have been this idea that they would have not have handled it as tactfully. They would have used her disability and portrayed it as more of a crutch than rather her ability to persevere.
Or be a source of villainy. If you think of Don't Breathe, which takes blindness and makes it, this whole villainous thing, which is apparently turning into a heroic thing for the next one. Quite how you go heroic from the end for that character in the previous film, I don't know, but anyway. And with the alcoholism, they recreate something from the book early on that is maybe not as effective as the book, because the book really goes into some, King does some fantastically seedy detail in it, but when Danny awakens in a woman's bed and finds himself at this low point, recollecting memories of the night before where he got into a fight, and the mother is clearly an unfit mother, and it turns out, and he goes to steal money from her, and then the child comes out with this soiled nappy and in a horrible state. Again, King describes this scene in such a way that is thoroughly unpleasant. It just puts you right in the moment, of how bleak and desolate Danny's life is now that this is normal, and he's still contemplating stealing money from this person because he can justify it, in that she stole from him probably. It's like, even though he has no real proof or memory with everything that happened. It's horrid, it's a horrid thing. And I think Flanagan rams it home by having the later thing where he reveals that they've passed away from ignorance, and he feels so guilty and responsible for that. It sort of pushes him further into helping Abra properly and caring for Abra. such an effective part of the book, and it as much as difficult to sort of translate, again, Flanagan does a pretty decent job at making it a key moment in Danny's character.
Yeah, and I think again it just speaks to, while that's in the theatrical version, I think at the same time though, like having the added time to the runtime of the film, it makes his decision to help Abra feel that much more organic or that much more formulative over time. It doesn't feel like an immediate thing. I think I did go back and rewatch the theatrical version at one point after seeing the director's cut, and in that loss of whatever it is, 25 or 30 minutes, it does feel like he comes around a lot sooner. Yeah. And I find that fleshing out not only his talks with Dick Hallorann when he appears, but also his time at the hospice, fleshing out and showing the impact that his shining ability has on the patients and giving them comfort and sharing an intimate moment with these people. It really does show the good in The Shining, in addition to showing potentially that cats also have The Shining in them, some of them. But I just love that we get so many human moments that are crossed with so many horrifying moments, like when that woman and her zombie baby at that point appear in his bed later on and finding out, oh, they had both perished. I mean, these are a series of events that in the director's cut are lined up in a way that it feels like this is the natural decision for him to make. It doesn't feel like a plot device. It doesn't feel like, oh, you know, he's got to help her at some point. It feels like it is a learned and then an accepted role that he has to take. He has to be her shepherd as Dick Hallorann was for him. And I think that is such an important part to the overall movie that gives it this sort of dark fantasy odyssey feel to the entire thing that just, it holds up, or again, it makes me want to go back and read the novel, which I've never read. So it would be a first time read of Dr. Sleep for me. But it's one of those things where it's like, if this is as quality as Flanagan could make it, I want those little details that you could only do in a book, right? Yeah. You said that scene is made so much more, it's disturbing when he sees the dead woman and the zombie baby, of course, but those little details I feel would just make it that much more real and that much more that this is the only decision that he can make based on his experiences.
This is just it. And there are other key points that Flanagan recreates quite well, namely Rose the Hat. I mean, to talk about this film, to get this far into this podcast and not talk about Rose the Hat seems odd, but I thought we had to get through the other parts first, because
absolutely,
you know, in the book alone already this, you know, enigmatic threat, this otherworldly being almost, that feels like the first real difference to, you know, the other side of The Shining, if you will. It's this very physical interpretation of what The Shining is and what the ghosts of the Overlook were. And two things really work well, I think, with this film in that regard, is that Rebecca Ferguson is perfect. She does such an amazing job in making Rose the Hat the right kind of Rose the Hat, and establishing it in two key scenes in the entire film really make it for her character. I mean, the initial one we get with her, with taking that girl away, you know, without ever showing anything in that scene, they establish her menace and her, you know, her persuasive attitude, and how you can still see she's dangerous. You know, it's like you're seeing a tiny fish just in front of a shark. You know, it feels like that. You know that the trouble is coming, but you know that little fish doesn't know that it's going to get eaten. You know, it's horrifying to think at that point. But later, where you have the baseball kid, played by Jacob Tremblay, you know, who's an established child actor, you know, in Oscar-winning films, you know, like Room, and to a lesser extent the not Oscar-winning Predator, which is still good. But you know, he's, you know, you put a kid of that stature in the film and then getting killed off so brutally and so nastily, you know, it's like the way they do that, it really drives home how nasty and how uncaring and how inhuman the True Knot are, and especially Rose the Hat, who gleefully accepts the idea of having to kill children to get what they want, and that's a hard thing to do, I think, as a role, and I think it is full credit to Rebecca Ferguson for doing it so well and just playing it off in a way that isn't hammy or stupid or because it could easily have been this melodramatic villain, and it's like, while she does sort of play up to the camera and really make it this big thing and this big ego, it makes sense because she's this creature effectively that has lived for hundreds of years, and she thinks she's better than any human being there is. So preying on kids is sport, for them, and it shows throughout. And her arrogance is a key part of what makes her a compelling character. You're rooting for her to get beaten, and when Abra outwits her, it's such a satisfying moment, that she gets land on her ass as she does, and then later it makes when she's really just saying, well, fuck that, then I'm gonna go at you. It makes that confrontation all the more compulsive to watch. It's I don't think it gets talked about enough as a great horror performance. I think she is given a fantastic account of that character, and there have been plenty of actors who have done right by King characters, especially villains, over the years. Jack Nicholson being one, and you think of in Misery with Kathy Bates and that, but Rebecca Ferguson should honestly be up there in terms of representing King villains, because she does some nasty stuff. She is the right kind of alluringly nasty. It works so well. It astounds me, because even though that character is great in the book and has a lot of those features, to carry that to the big screen is impressive, to say the least.
Yeah, I think the best way to put it is she's enchantingly sinister, both in her appearance, but also in the sort of flowery way that she is able to really draw people in, right? That first instance being the most representative of that, I think, in that she is kind of luring this little girl in and trying to selling her on magic and then flowers, of course, and then she has that sinister line where it's like, honey, it's the special ones that take the best, and then all the True Knot people kind of swarm her, which is a very disturbing moment without showing anything, right? It's this idea that this little girl is being preyed upon by this gang of roving otherworldly beings at this point, which you learn later. But I think just the nastiness is so key in really signifying that these people are so indifferent to human beings because they've been around for so long. Yeah. I think that comes across really, really well in that, again, they're so unflinching in not only hurting children, hurting both boys and girls, but it's this idea that they're not only just hurting them, they're consuming their essence, essentially. And that is so disturbing. And then, of course, Flanagan, in the way that he's able to really make a physical manifestation of that in a way that does not feel overly gory, or maybe just, he's not super concerned with shocking with graphic content. It's more about the reality of, you're going to see some blood, but it's tied to a child, right? It's this idea that he's able to make scenes very disturbing and violent without ever taking it to the degree where it's like, I need to stop watching. I had a conversation recently with somebody about Gerald's Game, and we had a similar point about Flanagan's use of violence and graphic content is so sparingly used, but when he uses it, it's very memorable.
Very much so. Yeah.
I almost related to somebody like Jeremy Saulnier, who does Green Room, Blue Ruin in these movies, and his movies are obviously not horror, but the way he approaches violence feels very horror in that it's very reserved, but when it happens, you remember it.
Yeah.
There's no way you leave one of his movies and you forget a moment of violence. And I feel that way about Mike Flanagan, whether it's kind of this now tying into a conversation you and I had about Resident Evil Village not too long ago, but his fascination with like fucking up people's hands.
Yeah.
Like Gerald's game, the degloving, and then of course in Dr. Sleep, like Rose the Hat, she gets her hand stuck in the filing cabinet, which is basically a representation of Abra's mind, and then basically has to rip her hand out, and then she just shreds her hand. And so that's probably like 2 of 3 moments of graphic violence in the film, but it is goddamn memorable, and it is just as terrifying, and it's satisfying because it's like you've seen this woman expertly, and her performance is, again, like of a caliber that it should be talked about far more frequently than it is, but she's so good at making you hate her that it feels satisfying when it's like, oh, okay, she finally got hers. After what she did to, quote unquote, the baseball boy, she finally got hers to a certain extent. And I think that that's a combination of Rebecca Ferguson's performance, but it's also Flanagan smartly being like, we're going to build up to these moments in a way. There's a greater significance than it just being like, oh, character got hurt, they shredded their hand to a certain degree, or there's graphic content or something like that. He just has everything feels methodical in the way that he approaches everything. Had any of those moments been too early or too far back, or it feels like just out of place enough, they would not have had the same significance, I think, that they do in the exact moment that they're placed in the film.
Yeah. And to sort of further elaborate, as much as we can talk about Rebecca Ferguson, then you have to talk about Abra herself. You know, it's a whole other thing. It's the cat and mouse game that they go between in their mind is a fun part of the film, you know, a fun part of the book too. It is just the constant outsmarting of her. As I said, Kylie Curran, who plays Abra in the film, is again a perfect representation of the book character for me. You know, she gets it. You know, she gets what she's supposed to be, and she's this overeager kid that, you know, wants to be accepted for what she has, and she finally has a chance to use the powers that she's been given for good. You know, and you know, rather than be told not to do it, not keep them secret, keep them hidden. And here she comes up against an actual adversary, and she is so into it, you know, to a fault, that it's such a fascinating watch, you know, seeing, especially as you were saying, the aforementioned thing where Rose the Hat has to skin her hand to get out of Abra's mind trap. You know, it's like, it's wonderfully executed that you know, she just manages to set this little trap and do it like that. It's the right mix with Kylie Curran, that she makes it, there's innocence there, but also this knowing that comes from having that power where, you know, she can read thoughts and know what people are thinking and how they're feeling. She's old before her time, but still very much a child. And you can see exactly why Danny resonates with that and why he wants to protect her, because he's been there, you know.
It's a perfect a mentee for the mentor. And I think also, not to keep harping on the length of the film, but I feel that the way that Flanagan interweaves all of these narratives, right? The True Knot, Doc, and then Abra, you really feel like you're seeing her grow up essentially, and you are becoming more and more invested in her because you've seen her as a child and realizing, hey, I'm different. I can outwit and outperform the magician that shows up as my 5-year-old birthday or whatever.
Yeah.
But then you get to see her really come into those powers in a way that feels formative in terms of The Shining, right? And she doesn't have all of that trauma that Doc did, right? It's an interesting parallel between their upbringings and the way in which they use their powers and how frightening the powers are for them based on their upbringing, right?
Yeah.
With Doc, his upbringing with the powers seems to be much more traumatic because, of course, he grew up in an abusive household, whereas Abra has 2 loving parents, and she plays the piano, she makes the silverware fly into the ceiling, and it doesn't feel like a burden. No. Which, if anything, Doc almost has an advantage at that point because the powers are something that he's scared of. So he is the one that says, hey, we should keep our heads down. Whereas Abra has, of course, this comes with her age and being a child, she has more naivete in terms of like how she should use her powers and how we have to go after this. Whereas she doesn't realize the real world implications, which clearly Doc does, even from a young age, even if he had not necessarily had a parent die at that point, up before obviously going to the Overlook, he still lives in a world where violence is a factor. Violence from people that you love is a factor, which just makes him more primed to suffer trauma, but to also have a more understanding of the world. The world is not always the most embracing of places. And I think that comparing the contrast between their two upbringings with the Shining powers, it does make for the perfect blend of a mentor and a mentee. And it's a relationship that I think is definitely one of the stronger within the course of the film. But also, like you said, her performance is fantastic. That moment when she has been kidnapped by Crow Daddy and basically Doc speaks through her, I think is one of the strongest performances she gives, because it's so convincing. There is some editing, of course, to the way her voice sounds, but there's enough of her in that moment that she sells it so well that it is almost frightening how well she sells that she is Doc in this child's body, and just with his knowledge and planning, but at the same time with her willingness to really step to the True Knot and to be like, okay, these are a group of people we can't be afraid of anymore. We need to go to them, bring the fight to them.
Yeah, it is amazing how confident she can be, you know, when she does that sort of stuff. And again, it just speaks. I think Flanagan especially works best with female actors. I think he's proven that throughout, you know, with Hush, with Gerald's Game, with Haunting a Hill House, you know, with this, or even Ouija, Seeds of Evil. All of those had really strong female performances. He gets it so well, you know, or he frames it so well, you know. He has the right people around him to make it work, and this is further proof of that, you know. It's just like the zenith of that, you know. Such a confident young actor in Kylie Curran to take on a role like that, and yeah, it's astounding to think like that. I mean, as we said, there are, you know, more flamboyant, more strong appearances in this film than the likes of Rebecca Ferguson's Rose of the Hat, but she holds her own so well for what she's given, and it's very much down to Flanagan's experience with his previous films. You know, that he gets this out of her.
Flanagan always, his directing and his writing feel indicative of a director that is either writing or directing people as people.
Yeah.
Which sounds very simplistic, but it everything that he does, it feels like he is just doing it with thinking of the character first and making a character personable. And it's almost like he doesn't think about this is a female or a male character, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's this idea that this is going to be a character that stands on their own and serves a purpose regardless of if they're male or female, which I don't think is a coincidence, considering a majority of his films, they have such strong female characters, but his ability to just write them like they're any other character. Whereas sometimes I feel like some filmmakers, it's like, oh, I have to write this as a male character, I have to write this as a female character, which then brings out some of these tropes that we are often complaining about in media, right? This sort of like role representation. Whereas Rose the Hat, like, she is a very strong and sinister and enchantingly gorgeous, but also like seductive with language in a way that, had he tried to write her as just like a seductive female character, there might have been more, not that I think this is his temperament as a writer or as a director, but just in general, like if somebody had read King's novel other than Flanagan, they might lean more into the sexuality of that character more. Whereas Flanagan, he's like, okay, this is a person who obviously sexuality is a part of them, and she uses it, but it's never in a way that feels like it is just egregious or it's trying to evoke a reaction out of somebody. She's just enchantingly seductive enough with her sexuality that it draws somebody in, but it's never the full swath of who she is, and she's not defined by that, and that's so key, I think.
it's such a really great point, because the book very much does establish a relationship between Rose the Hat and the girl she brings in, whose name escapes me right now.
Snakebite.
Snakebite Andy. Yeah, it's like the book establishes them having a relationship, in between there. So it's kind of testament. It feels more natural the way Flanagan does it, to the way King does it, because I think if you'd added that to the screen, it does just make her more of a succubus, and like that. It would have been not right for the way they were portraying her on screen.
We should talk a little bit more about the finale and that triumphant return to the Overlook, and how that is such a nostalgia-laced moment, but I just love how Flanagan is able to take us back to a familiar place, and it feels like a combination of both King's vision, because of course of how Dr. Sleep ends, with how he originally wanted The Shining to end, but then it also mixes in a little bit of Kubrick. So I'm curious how you find the conclusion of Dr. Sleep and returning to the Overlook. Do you feel like it's a decent balance of all three voices, or do you find that it maybe gravitates more towards one over the other?
I think it does put the correction across from Kubrick's vision then to make it more like King's, as you said, in how it culminates. But as I said earlier, I think it goes a little overboard in doing too much. It feels a bit Ghostbusters 2. In terms of sort of unleashing the beasts you had in the first film. It works in the overall scheme of things, because outside of Abra's story, you're dealing with Danny's trauma, and how he is bottled all this, literally not so much bottled it up, but he has boxed it up, all his traumas from the Overlook, and now is here at a place where he's effectively made peace with the idea that he's saving this girl, and he's trying to end this cycle, with the Overlook. So he feels like he can unleash it all, and get out of the way and resolve the problem at hand. But it doesn't quite work out for him, in the way he'd wanted. But Abra proves to save the day and be the strong hand that he never was, and maybe he believes that. I think he believed that all along, that she would be able to sort of trick anything that sort of took over him from the Overlook to sort of end it, and hence why they rigged the boiler to begin with.
On a rewatch, I don't know that I necessarily need the possession of him.
No.
I don't know that I necessarily need that, and that might be the only instance in the film that I find to be overly egregious in terms of like rekindling the past. I think that there's enough in the film for a majority of those scenes that Flanagan's able to put his spin on it. Like I said, that scene I could probably do without. I do really, really like the ending to the pre-ending to the film with the boiler scene, right? Yeah. And then he gets this moment where it's a young Doc talking with his mother again, and they have this kind of like warm embrace when he inevitably blows up and burns up and all of this. And then I really like the way that the film is capped off after that, this idea that Abra is still able to communicate with the now deceased Doc through the power of The Shining. Yeah. And he now has this, now it's a supernatural, furthermore supernatural or otherworldly relationship with him now that he's passed on, and has that same mentor-mentee relationship that he had with Dick Hallorann. And that's a really roundabout way that I love, because he gets closure, he gets to end that trauma cycle and whatnot, and he also got to help a child escape a different type of cycle.
Yeah.
Or maybe this is more a her just getting to outlive people that were hunting her and whatnot. I don't know if it's necessarily a cycle, but he was able to pay it forward, essentially. He took the words that Dick Hallorann told him and essentially giving him that, with great power comes great responsibility. He talks about how the why doesn't matter. It's all about what you do with it and whatnot. And I think that it's so key that they can still have that relationship even after he's passed on and found peace.
Yeah.
Because now she gets to have peace. It doesn't end the movie in a well, I guess it is a traumatic event, all this shit. There's no way that she is not somewhat scarred by it all. But the idea that like this person that came into her life suddenly that had such a profound effect is now just gone. It gives the movie somewhat of an uplifting ending. This idea that she still has some communication with this person who became Uncle Dan, right? This idea, he became a family member essentially. So I don't know. It would have been a little more bittersweet if she had not been able to communicate with him after he dies, just because of the sacrifice he made. Of course, she gets to live, but also he's not completely gone. Somewhat gone, but not completely gone. And I think that, again, is Flanagan thinking about characters and their emotions first, because otherwise she's just going to be even more traumatized than she probably already is to some extent.
It throws back to the idea that she came from a happier childhood where she understood that she had powers and she repressed them, much like Danny had to, to please her parents, but with a different angle. Danny suppressed his power because he didn't want the anger of his father, whereas Abra does it because she doesn't want to embarrass her parents, and she learns through this situation. And her mother, different to Danny's mother, learns that that's who she is, and that's part of it. And that's why Abra then sort of confesses that okay, I'm not gonna lie to you, I was talking to Dan, and even though he's a ghost, and things like that. She's doing what Danny could not, in accepting that this is what she can do, and she's not going to lie about it. She's not going to hide it, like Danny did. And Danny did, and look where it got him. He ended up an alcoholic and tortured by everything, and ultimately died for it. It's like, as much as it was for a noble cause, he died for it. But he died so that Abra could have this sort of this rewrite of that situation, where she could be a happier person and more accepting what she is and what power she has, and now without the imminent threat of the True Knot that they had.
I love that the film ends for her the way that it began for Doc, which was this idea that she sees the rotting woman much like him, and that it's the reality that nothing is over just because the Overlook is passed on, right? But it's something that you can live with, and she has the healthy alternative way to live with it, right? She came to the realization much sooner. Pair that with her happy upbringing, she doesn't have to turn to the bottle right away like Doc did, unfortunately. And while he is very much a cautionary tale, it's nice that she's able to learn from his mistakes in a way that doesn't feel like his alcoholism is ever used as, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like Flanagan exploits his alcoholism in a way where it's just like, don't ever do that. It's kind of just this idea that it's like, she learns that there is an alternative to being afraid. And of course, alcoholism was a byproduct of that fear and that unresolved trauma. She is just able to learn a solution to it in a way that is more healthy without it being like, don't ever do that. Because then it just feels kind of like, is he just an alcoholic in this point just to drive that point home? And I think that would do his character a disservice, because again, the way it's presented is, it feels very real. Another part of that feels like it is for a spectacle, or this is just a crutch we're going to give this character. And it's something that I'm impressed upon, how Flanagan is just able to really take lots of real world issues and what could be perceived as tropes by most filmmakers. He's able to really give a grounding sense to even these dark fantasy odysseys such as Dr. Sleep.
Yeah, sure, because as much as his father was an alcoholic and that weakened him somewhat to succumbing to the hotel, as much as that wasn't explored in Kubrick's films, that is the de facto way it was. He has gone through his life thinking that he's not going to be like that. He's not going to be like that. And it's true. He doesn't end up being an alcoholic because he copies what his father did. He ends up doing it because he's trying to avoid it. He comes to the same conclusion by a different trauma. Jack's trauma is he feels trapped. You know, he feels like he rushed into a family life, and he feels guilty about how he's reacted, you know, and it just drives him further and further and further. And being at the Overlook just exacerbates that situation. You know, the whole original Shining Tale is that it's less a ghost story, it's more a story of addiction, you know, and how in the wrong circumstances it could drive everyone away, you know, and there is no one key way of that happening. And that's Dr. Sleep's story, you know, is that Danny thinks he can get away from that by doing what he's told by Dick to lock the ghosts away, but it isn't enough. You know, he wants to dull that power. He doesn't want to ever have to interact with any of these ghosts again. And the only way he knows how from his limited life experience, because of the way everything that's happened with his father and his mother, is to drink. You know, because it's the only thing that helps. The minute something helps in terms of addiction, that's it. That's your crutch. That is what makes it work for you. And that happens. And he is very much limited by that. And he tries his best to get out of it. And Abra really does help, you know, and as well as sorting his life out, you know, as he does. And he gets so close to sort of succumbing to that addiction late on in the film, and giving in to the whole thing, and he doesn't. It's a good allegory for how addiction could be, especially alcoholism. You know, while it's not, it is surface level in a lot of ways, it is a really well done thing in how they manage it. And I know we praised, you know, the female performances so far in this film, but Ewan McGregor, you know, I think really well cast here. He is. I wasn't sure about that. I had to be in that. But when you get into the film and how he acts about everything and how he does it, he really does just give this sad sack alcoholic with this huge trauma some real levity. You know, he really makes it something. And again, it's whether you call that melodrama or whatever, he knows. Ewan McGregor, you know, people used to take the piss out of his Obi-Wan Kenobi performance, you know, back in the day, and yet nowadays people clamor for it. You know, they want it. They want him to do it again. He is doing it again. You know, Ewan McGregor is great, and you know, his breakout role was in Trainspotting, which is a movie about addiction. This is perfect for him. You know, he knows how to do that sort of thing. You know, he did it so well there, and even in the sequel to that, and here he is so good at purveying this sort of sad sack, real life sort of addict. You know, and it just shows that, you know, not every addict is totally tragic, even though his character here is. It's like they do want to break out of that cycle, you know, and he does that so well. It's amazing.
Yeah, he dispels that myth that it's like, oh, they're addicts because they enjoy the benefits from or the feeling of what they are consuming, which is very rarely the case, but it's this idea that it really dispels that notion.
Yeah.
And like you said, it doesn't feel like it is I at least don't feel like it's a dramatized version, or it feels like it is melodramatic in that regard. The ways in which we see his stages of addiction, it all feels, again, like a natural progression to where he ends up. This idea that we see his rock bottom, and it's violent, and it's upsetting, and it's sad, and yet we don't have to get the first 45 minutes of the movie of him doing that. No. And that comes back to Flanagan knowing how to direct certain people, but also just being a storyteller in general. This idea that those moments can be filed down to a few key instances and then move on from it. Because otherwise, it becomes him trying to do just an addiction movie in the same vein as Trainspotting, to the degree where we see this addiction, but it's an example throughout the entire course of the film. And that's not me taking the piss out of Trainspotting or anything, but it's this idea that like addiction ties into this film in a much grander scale.
Yeah.
It's the core of it in a lot of ways, but it never becomes the sole focus, because otherwise that would be disingenuous, obviously, to the true volume and scale of this story. And there's so much in this film, and I feel like, we've talked now for a little more than an hour, but it's this idea, it's a film with so many layers that you just feel like you've scratched the surface of it. But it's one that I think is worth talking about, worth revisiting, and it's a film that I'm so happy fans have obviously by now have discovered it, but it's a film that is being celebrated still.
Yeah.
And serves as the reality that people should probably not judge the idea of sequels to classic horror films or remakes to a certain extent in that regard, because there's in the right hands, they can be just as comparable to the original, or they can be perfectly fine ways to complement them.
And look, yeah, get this right. The Shining is up there in like the 50 odd movies that I consider 5-star movies, of like 2,500 movies, whatever I've seen. It was so formative. Me and my brother watching that at my uncle's, seeing that bathroom scene with the old hag, it was so impactful. And that movie ended up being so, just because it's so dreamlike and unreal, it ended up being such a thing. It ended up being a major part of why I love horror, why I love Stephen King. So to get to this sequel, as much as I like Flanagan's work, I can appreciate he's not perfect like anyone, but this, he really did a great job in continuing this story. That King, as much as I appreciate this with King, it's like he continued this story in a way that really felt right to me and personal, and I was so happy to see it play out the way it did. And Flanagan captures it perfectly to me. He captures what King had in mind for continuing that, whilst also servicing a film that is iconic, despite the fact that it ignores much of many of the themes that the book had. Yes, I'll admit it is not as good as The Shining, because The Shining is just what it is. It is iconic. It is the zenith. It's up there in amongst the greatest horror films there ever are. No doubt about that. But this is so ballsy to try and emulate and continue that it deserves so much credit for doing it, and it does it so well that it's, The Shining is a 5-star movie. This is 4.5. It is that close.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a perfect movie, but Flanagan achieved the impossible. He made a more than competent, and I think it's fantastic, and I would say it's, I would give it the same rating of 4.5. It's this idea that he did the impossible, and he was able to make something that complements, that references, and that allows his own horror voice to really flourish in a pre-existing thing in a way that doesn't take away from what was done by the author or the first filmmaker that adapted it, but his voice doesn't get lost. No. And I think that that's so key, and that's why I almost think it's a discredit to say, me myself had said, that he is the de facto Stephen King adaptator, because the idea that he is adapting these works so well, he is the best person to do it, but his own voice comes through.
Yeah.
It's not the same as just any other more than competent director that is well versed in King's voice doing the same thing, because Flanagan's style and temperament as a director does not get lost in seemingly a single frame of this, and it just stands as a testament to a fantastic film that should not be as good as it is, and yet I'm more than happy that we got a follow-up to one of the best horror films ever made.
Yeah, it's like I said before, it really shouldn't have worked. It's a novel that still divides people to this day, but and a lot of later King adaptations haven't worked out, yeah, boy, this was just the best surprise.
Absolutely, and I think for anybody that hasn't checked out Dr. Sleep because you're hesitant about his follow-up to The Shining and whatnot, you should probably get over that and just watch probably one of the greatest horror sequels ever made, in my opinion. But Neil, as always, this was a pleasure to chat horror with you, and especially talk Mike Flanagan for Masters of Horror this month.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service, and follow the show on Instagram at Daily Horror Habit and on Twitter at Daily Horror Pod for episode updates. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.